free to choose medicine is a bold, common sense reform proposal that empowers patients advised by their doctors to make informed decisions on the use of not yet FDA approved drugs that have passed FDA safety trials.
Why do they have to have passed the safety trial? Why can't they just, I'm just trying to imagine, I'm fortunate enough I don't have a late stage illness, but if I knew that there might be something out there, it was a Hail Mary pass, I don't know what it's going to do to me, but I have a month to live or something. Why should you even have to go over the hurdle of the safety trial?
The free to choose medicine, as outlined in my book, is geared to pass a Free to Choose Medicine Act. And we need something that's politically doable. And therefore, you have to concern yourself about trial lawyers who do not want people to make responsible contracts and what have you. So what's laid out in the book is a very doable plan that addresses, safety issues that a lot of people will raise. So that the idea is, here's how it would work. With a free to choose medicine, we would have a dual track system. So on one track, the drug developer would continue along the conventional FDA clinical testing, the FDA undisturbed. But on a separate free to choose track, operated independently of the FDA, that a drug developer whose drug has passed safety trials and has made progress in phase 2 clinical testing, so we have some real data out there, that drug would be available on the free to choose track. Now, patients and doctors need to make an informed decision. And the way that would happen is that they'd be able to get on the internet and have access to a trade-off evaluation database that includes the up-to-date information on approved drugs and free to choose track drugs. So patients and doctors can make that call.
Who updates, runs, and maintains that?
That has to be worked out in the political process. But the key point is it needs to be independent of the FDA. Because historically, when there have been movements to accelerate FDA testing and approval, as Dr. Henry Miller has pointed out in his book, that the FDA writes the regulations to implement the legislation to reduce the FDA's power. And you can see that that loses steam very, very quickly. So the free to choose medicine proposal says that the dual track and the trade-off evaluation database is independent of the FDA. So what we would have is consumer choice and competition.
How long can a drug go after it's passed a safety trial, and maybe there's some decent data
Sure.
In phase 2 before it will, and assuming it's ultimately approved, before it'll get to market? What's an average amount of time? Because what you're trying to do is close that
Sure.
for folks.
Sure.
What amount of time are we talking about?
Roughly speaking, say the midpoint of phase 2, if a free to choose track drug was available, then a patient could save, say, 5 years.
So we're talking lots and lots of patients in that amount of time
Right.
who have access to something that 5 years down the road we know that it could save them or at least help them.
So when you have consumer choice and competition at work, you have a dynamic system and you have feedback. Right now, there's no feedback as to the amount of regulation that the FDA is imposing upon us. In other words, no one knows what the optimal regulatory load is, and the FDA continually demands ever more extensive clinical testing. So your earlier question on safety, let's return to that one. With free to choose medicine, let's just say there's a new drug out for ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. It's a horrible disease. The approved treatment doesn't work. So if a drug in phase 2 testing is showing some very, very good results, ALS patients, would take that drug. And the better the results, the more use. So that what you would have is that as more and more people on the free to choose track take a drug, if there are adverse side effects, for example, they're more apt to show up when volunteers, more and more volunteers are taking the drug, compared to clinical trial testing, which would have a much smaller number of people involved, and clinical trials try to get literally twins, everyone to have the same sort of medical conditions. So safety problems show up when you have a large population and there's some health condition gets ticked off, and then you get that adverse side effect. So with free-to-choose track drugs that get heavy usage, you would get a better safety profile when that drug finally gets approved.
Just a couple more questions for you. The way that a trial works, there is a group that's given the medicine and then a group that's given a placebo. And they don't know, correct? Is there a concern that if you have this dual track, somebody will say, well, gee, I could go into a trial, but I may not know if I'm getting something that's working. Why don't I just skip that and go straight to the free-to-choose track where at least I know I'm getting the medicine? So, in other words, is there an argument that this idea could somehow undermine the traditional process of actually finding out whether or not...
Yeah, the issue is enrollment in clinical trials, and there's a section in my book on that. As far as if you have an ethical, a clinical trial, by ethical is that knowledgeable doctors don't really know if the experimental drug will work any better than what it's being tested against. That's an ethical trial. And in that situation, just because that experimental drug is available on a free-to-choose track, it shouldn't interfere with enrollment. Where it will interfere with enrollment is when knowledgeable doctors have formed a consensus that this new drug, not yet approved, really works better. And that, I claim, is an unethical clinical trial. So there would be an enrollment problem in unethical clinical trials, and that should put pressure on the FDA to innovate its testing procedures.
And maybe shorten the window until approval, or at least where decisions are...
Well, right now the FDA doesn't have any competition. So the same way when competition in the form of FedEx arrived, that the post office then responded and they gave us one-day delivery for mail. The same thing would happen. Free-to-choose medicine would put competitive pressure on the FDA, and it would make for more streamlined clinical trials, and that's the key variable to reducing clinical trial costs in order to reduce prescription drug prices.
The book has a foreword from Vernon Smith. Vernon is a Nobel Prize winning economist and an interesting guy. And I understand you've done some work with him. Just tell people who may not know that much about a little bit about Vernon and your work with him and why he's enthusiastic about this.
Oh, Vernon's a great guy, and he won the Nobel Prize partly for his work in terms of efficient ways to deregulate markets. And early on, when I described this notion of a dual-track system, he was a strong supporter of that being a practical way to bring consumer choice and competition to the FDA. And those are the key ingredients for making society better off.
The last question for you. Obviously, you're hoping to change the regulatory structure as it currently is, or require legislation. There's some interest in this idea already on Capitol Hill, right? Senator Jim DeMint, I know, is aware of this and is interested in it. What's the state of affairs with that, with respect to Capitol Hill and potential legislation?
Well, we're optimistic. We're still in the early stages right now, just getting awareness of this proposal out there. I would hope that in 2011, perhaps a bill could be introduced in Congress.
Well, if there's a repeal of the current health care law after the 2010 elections, or at least some changes, maybe this could be thrown into the mix for consideration. It's a very interesting idea. The book is Free to Choose Medicine. The author is Bart Madden, who's my guest today. Bart, thanks so much for joining me and telling us about your ideas, and good luck.
Thanks, Nick.